change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind. If it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of 1st and 2nd Samuel. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
And then we start chapter 4 with Ishbosheth, who we also really don't know much about. We don't know anything good or bad. But it seems in all of these matters that he's the real loser here, because we know he wasn't a great warrior or a strong, capable leader, that he's only been a puppet king whose fate was really in the hands of Abner. And he was already scared when Abner was changing his alliances to David. And now he knows it's inevitable that he will lose his kingdom. And he doesn't have a plan. And he doesn't know what to do. And so he's depressed. And so we see he starts to taking a lot more naps in the afternoon. And he's not the only one who's troubled here, because the whole kingdom is troubled. And though the leaders of Israel, they're aware of Abner's meeting with David, the common people, they weren't. And now they're all hearing that Abner's dead. And Ishbosheth here, he's not knowing David's intent. He's probably in fear for his life, that David will be coming for him next. And there's no Abner to protect him. So with Abner gone, we're introduced to these two other captains of Ishbosheth's armies, and they're brothers. They're also both from the tribe of Benjamin. And their name is Baana and Raham, who I call banana and rhubarb, and it sounds like something Bev would make for us, like a crisp or something. But these guys, they should really be called something like Tony and Luigi, because these guys, they act like mobsters. But right here in the middle of their story, which seems like a really odd place, we're told another story, a different story. And we're introduced to Mephibosheth, Jonathan's son and Saul's grandson. And we hear about this tragic accident that occurred to him when Saul's household was fleeing after Saul and Jonathan were killed in battle. Because at that time, the whole house of Saul, they were fearing that the Philistines were going to come and execute the whole royal family, all of Saul's descendants. And at that time, this boy, being only 5 years old, he was dropped by his nurse. We don't know how. Maybe she tripped, but whatever it was an accident. And Mephibosheth, it left him lame in both of his feet. So maybe he broke both of his ankles, and they didn't really know how to set bones that well back then. But the reason that he's mentioned here at this time is because now that boy is 12 years old, and he's the last living heir to Saul's throne after Ishbosheth. And then we come back now to banana and rhubarb, also known as Luigi and Tony, because this story is about as violent as any mafia movie. And with these two knowing that Abner's deal was dead, because Abner was dead, they should take this opportunity to make their own deal for themselves, a deal that's in their own best interest with David, just like Abner was doing. And so these gangsters, they're now trying to make themselves a deal that you can't refuse. But these guys, they're not as diplomatic as Abner, and they have no honor or loyalty to anyone except to themselves. And so these two trusted captains of Ishbosheth's army, they're going into Ishbosheth's palace, pretending to get some wheat from the storehouse to feed their men. And they bring in this empty bag, but they're not going to put grain in it. But they sneak up to Ishbosheth's bedroom at noon, and they kill Ishbosheth on his bed. And then they cut off his head and they stuff it in the bag, and they ruined a perfectly good nap. And it seems like those kind of movies where you have Uncle Louie and Uncle Tony, and they're going to go take you out for ice cream. And they go, oh, hey, you go sit up front, Ishbosheth. And then you get in the car and bang, bang, bang. And then you get in the back of the head, and then they cut off your head. They don't just cut off a finger. They cut your big fat head off for a positive ID. And that would have been a great plan if David was anything like them. But he's not, because the only crime that Ishbosheth is guilty of was being King Saul's son. Ishbosheth never did anything wrong. And then Banana and Rhubarb, they travel all night to Hebron with Ishbosheth's head in the bag, and then they present Ishbosheth's head to David. And then they have the gall to say to David that God did this, that this was from the Lord, that the Lord has delivered you from your enemy Saul and from his descendants. But David, he's proven over and over that Saul was never his enemy, and that Abner was not his enemy. And even Ishbosheth, he wasn't David's enemy either. And then David tells Banana and Rhubarb something they probably already knew. He told them about when the Amalekite told David that Saul was dead and was looking for a reward, that he killed him. And David tells him this is much worse than that. And so David, he then calls Ishbosheth a righteous man. And then he calls them wicked for killing him in his bed, that they're cowards. And David here, he had no intention, I believe, of ever killing Ishbosheth. And so now David, now he's giving orders like he's the godfather now. And then he has these two guys whacked. He goes, here's your reward, bang, bang, bang. And then there's some more cutting off of all the body parts. So these mafia movies, they really don't have anything on these guys. David, he really knows how to send out a message, cutting off their hands and then their feet. And then he goes and hangs their body down at the pool of Hebron. And in my hometown, we did hang up Christmas decorations, but we never decorated like this, where everyone in town coming down to get their daily water, they get to see firsthand how you get rewarded if you're going to live like a mobster. They're just hanging up there for all the kids to see. I'm kind of glad we don't live in a society like that these days, where you just kind of go out to Walmart or you go to Costco and you see all these bodies hanging on the wall and say, and the kid's saying, hey, Mom, look, it's Luigi, it's Uncle Tony. But today in our America, we live in different times. But it's not a far stretch to see our society turn back to justify these kind of ways, because we do see in the book of Revelation where they will kill the two prophets of God, and they'll leave their bodies out unburied in the streets for 3 days, with everyone just celebrating and sending presents to each other. And then David, he has them bury Ishbosheth's head with Abner's body. And I don't know why, because it didn't seem like they were really getting along that well at the end, but they are family, and they're both from Saul's household, and it's honorable to do this. And so with Ishbosheth's death, where Israel, they now have no king, and without Abner, they have no one to lead the army into battle. So now they turn to David. And it's kind of sad that they turn to David when they have no other choice. They only choose David over a 12-year-old crippled boy. But that's really the way a lot of people, they turn to Jesus. They only turn to Jesus when they have no other choice. But the tribes now of Israel, they finally do the right thing, and they come to David in Hebron, and they ask David to be their shepherd, to be their king, and they remind David that he's of their own bone and flesh, which means he's a Jew. And then they remind David of what God said about him shepherding Israel. And so now all the elders from all the tribes that come and they make their covenant with David. They swear their allegiance to David. Where David, he had once been anointed privately by Samuel, is now anointed publicly in front of all Israel. And then if you look at this from First Chronicles, we're told that there was also like 340,000 soldiers who came, who also swore their allegiance to David, and that they had this feast, and that feast lasted for 3 days. All right. So now we go to our application and we see that there's two kind of people here. You have most of them that are just looking out for themselves and are only looking out for their own best interests. And then you see one man, you see David, who's very far from perfect, but he waits for God and he trusts him. And so this is where you have to make a choice, because you can be a wise guy or you can be God's guy. You can be a good fellow or you can be God's fellow. You can act like a godfather or you can act like God the Father. And to most of us, most people, they're like the first ones. They don't ever commit themselves and commit their lives to God. And if you ask them, you say, well, how are you doing with God? They're going to say, well, I'm okay with God, because everybody thinks that they're okay with God, but they're not. But you need to be okay with God. And if you're not okay with God, then we need to talk about it. We need to pray about it. You need to commit yourself to God, because the majority of people, they're not really doing right. I'm not saying anybody here is not doing right, but I know that most of them, they weren't King David's. They were other people. So we don't want you to be like that. So if you need prayer about anything, and if you don't know God and you want to know him and you want to pray about it, just grab me after. We'll be here for a while. So last week, after Abner and Ishbosheth's assassinations, the 11 tribes of Israel were left without a king, without anybody to lead them. And so we saw the elders from the 11 tribes come down to Hebron and crown David king, quoting what God had said about David, that he was to shepherd God's people. And then we're told how long David reigned as king, being over Judah for 40 years, but over Israel for only 33 years. And this tells us that David, that he lived until he was 70 years old. But today, in our story, David is only about 38 years old. And the first thing David does under a united Israel is to move its capital. And it seems like David, that he had his eye on a certain place for quite a while. He's probably been watching it since his days of being a shepherd in Bethlehem, because Jerusalem is only a stone's throw away from Bethlehem, where David grew up. And David's whole life tending sheep, he probably saw how secure this city of the Jebusites was. Jebus being Jerusalem's ancient name. And nobody has been able to drive out these Jebusites out of that city for over 400 years. And that's because this part of Jerusalem is built into a rocky hillside, and it's surrounded on three sides by valleys that are deep and also some ravines, where the only way to enter this city was on the north side. And that was by just a very narrow path that was easily defended. And it's just like how David described this city in Psalm 48, where he says, beautiful for situation, the joy of the whole earth is Mount Zion, which is the same as Jerusalem, on the sides of the north, the city of the great king. And where he says the great king here, he's not talking about himself. He's talking about God. And so the Jebusites, this ancient people living in Mount Zion, they're thinking that their city is impregnable, and they're feeling so secure about it that they mock David. And they're saying that they don't even have to try to defend their city from David, that even the lame and the blind could do it, which seems crazy, that this tiny little city-state with not a very large army in comparison to the size of Israel's army would even want to try to poke David in the eye. But they do, because that's how secure they felt. And they were right, except that David knew that they were vulnerable in that city from where they received their water supply. And we don't know how David knew this, but David knew about this water shaft that was carved vertically, almost straight up and down through sheer solid rock that was extremely narrow. And they said it was about 5 feet in diameter. And that shaft, it goes into a pool that's fed by the Gihon spring. And so this shaft, it would have been used to bring in fresh water into the city during a time of siege. And David, he himself, he didn't want to climb it because this would be about the same thing as climbing up a chimney. And this shaft, it ran for 42 and a half feet. And so David, he makes this offer to anyone who's able to do this and to take out the guard and to let David into the city, that he'll get the position of commander of his army. And there was no way that Joab was going to let anyone else become the commander of David's army. And so he climbs up that shaft. And this shaft that Joab, that he climbs up, was found in 1867 by the archaeologist Sir Charles Warren. And so now the shaft is now called Warren's Shaft. And David here, he takes a city, and what's called here the stronghold of Zion. Zion is just a poetic name for Jerusalem, but it's actually unknown what it actually means. But David, he changes its name to the city of David. And this city is only 12 acres in size, and it's actually not even in the city of Jerusalem. It's actually south outside of the city walls, what we would call Jerusalem. And so this is a southern area, which is south from where the temple will eventually be built. But this now is where David dwells. And then we read about him building the Milo. And the Milo is a stepped terrace which made the land level so that David could build out. And that's where Jerusalem was built. And today, if you went over there, you would see the city of David, and you would see that most of it is under excavation, where they're finding all kinds of artifacts validating the names and the dates of this Davidic kingdom. And so David, he moves his capital city from Hebron to Jerusalem, which is one of the wisest things that David ever did. And it's not only because Jerusalem was a more defensible city, because it was only being able to be accessed from the northern side, but also because it is more centrally located in Israel, where Hebron would have been too far south in the territory of Judah. And that would have been a real hardship for the northern tribes, and it would have been hard for him to govern efficiently. And so David, now being the king of all Israel, and not just Judah's king, Jerusalem, he makes that the nation's capital. There's a good reason that he did it in Jerusalem, because Jerusalem is not part of Judah. Jerusalem is actually a part of Benjamin, but it's on the border of Judah. So he's not looking like he's taking sides or he's giving favoritism to his own tribe. And so now David, his influence as king, it's not only affecting the people of Israel, but it's also bringing a lot of positive support from some of the neighboring kingdoms. And we see here that there's Hiram, who is the king of Tyre, that he's not only sending the finest materials, the cedars of Lebanon, but he's also sending his own workmen who are the most skilled in building during this whole era. And so Hiram here, he builds David a palace. And it's thought that Hiram had to have been pretty young back at this time, because we'll see Hiram another 40 years later, and he'll do the same thing for Solomon. He'll build his palace, and he'll also build the temple of God. And so it says they built David a house. And what's really cool here is the way that David looks at this, because David, he doesn't look at this that they did it because he was so great and that he deserves all this, that he became great all by himself. But he realizes here that it was the Lord that had established him as king of Israel, and that he exalted his kingdom, and that his there, it's all in capital letters. So that's meaning that it's not David's kingdom, he's not the his, but that it's God's kingdom. And that's why he exalted David. And it wasn't for David's sake, but it was for Israel's sake. So God making David king was for the sake of God's people, Israel. And so now you have this boy that was the 8th son, the youngest son of a farmer named Jesse. And he's lived in caves for over 10 years of his life when he was running from Saul. And now he has the nicest house in all of Israel. He's the only one with a palace made out of cedar. And then we see that David, he takes some more wives and concubines, and he has some more sons and daughters. And it's never because God approved of this. This is just a fact, and so we're told about it. And the name that sticks out to us among these sons is Solomon. But we should also take note of David's son Nathan, because Mary, the mother of Jesus, she will descend from Nathan. She will not be a descendant of Solomon's. And later on, as we get through the scriptures, we'll find out why. But we never hear anything about any of these other sons of David. And then it comes to this place where now it mentions the Philistines again. And we haven't heard much about the Philistines for a while, not since chapter 1 of 2 Samuel, where there was the battle that killed Saul and Jonathan, where it doesn't seem like the Philistines, they cared much about David during that time when he was only the king of Judah, when the nation of Israel was divided into 2 kingdoms. But now, with David reigning over all Israel, with the nation joined again as one nation, the Philistines are back, where Israel has now become more of a threat to them again. And so now David, he's in his new capital of Jerusalem, and he's gathering his forces to the stronghold. We see the Philistines, and they start to gather again. But this time, they gather in the valley of Rephaim, which is just a little south of Jerusalem. And David, he still doesn't do anything without consulting God and without inquiring of him. And he asks God 2 questions. He says, should I go up against the Philistines, and will you deliver them into my hand? And the Lord says yes to both questions. And so David goes, and he doesn't just win the battle, but he sees that the Lord was involved in that battle, and that he saw that the Lord broke through the Philistines like the breaking of water. And whatever that looks like, it impressed David enough for him to change the name of that place to Baal Perizim, which means master of breakthroughs. And then the Philistines, after being defeated, they try to go do the same thing again. And so they're all gathered again to the very same place. And so they had to have been thinking that they should have won that first battle, and they have no idea why they lost, so they're willing to try it again. And maybe they're going to change a couple strategies or tactics. And David here, he could just think, well, we beat you once, and so we'll beat you again. So you want some more of this? Well, we'll give it to you. Where didn't we just do this? We'll just do it again the same way. Of course, God would do it the same way. Why would we need to ask him again? But David, he's not like that, because he's seeking the Lord in everything that comes up. And so he doesn't assume that the Lord's going to do it the same way every time. And it's a real good thing that David did seek the Lord, because God, he had a different plan. And this time when David sought the Lord, it wasn't just a yes or no answer. But the answer to the first question about going up against a Philistine was a no. And then the second part, God gave him specific instructions of how to go up.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. all the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,